Have you ever noticed that the men who spend the most time arguing with women are usually the men who get the least out of their relationships? They think if they can just explain themselves one more time, make one more point, or finally get her to see things from their perspective, everything will fall into place. But that's usually not how it works. In fact, when it comes to dealing with women, arguing is often one of the fastest ways to lose control of the situation. There's a reason for that. One of the most powerful lessons ever written about human nature comes from law number 9 of the 48 laws of power. Win through your actions, never through argument. And if there is one area of life where this law applies more than most men realize, it's relationships. The moment you find yourself going back and forth trying to prove you're right, convince her that your idea makes more sense, or force her to agree with your point of view, you've already stepped into a battle that rarely ends the way you expect. Before we even get started, let me give you something that can save you years of frustration. Every argument is a negotiation. Every negotiation requires leverage, and leverage comes from one thing above all else: the ability to walk away. In business, relationships, friendships, and life itself, the person who is willing to leave always has more power than the person who feels they must stay. If you don't have the ability to walk away, you've already weakened your position before a single word is spoken. Now, this doesn't mean you should never communicate with a woman. Communication is necessary. There will be times when you need to express yourself, explain your standards, and make your expectations clear. But communication and arguing are not the same thing. Most men confuse them, and that mistake costs them more than they realize. Over the years, I've noticed something interesting. Even when a man feels like he won the argument, he often loses something far more valuable in the process. Sometimes it's his peace. Sometimes it's his confidence. Sometimes it's the respect and attraction that existed before the argument ever started. And once you understand why that happens, you'll stop looking at arguments with women the same way ever again. The first reason arguing with a woman so often fails is because the moment emotions become involved, the conversation stops operating on the level most men think it does. A lot of men approach disagreements believing that facts, logic, and reason will solve the problem. That's how men typically deal with challenges. Identify the issue, figure out what caused it, and find a solution. Simple. But when emotions are elevated, people don't always respond to logic the way you expect them to. Think about what usually happens during an argument. Maybe you said something she didn't like. Maybe you disappointed her. Maybe she misunderstood your intentions. Maybe an old wound, insecurity, or fear was triggered by something that seemed completely harmless to you. Whatever the cause, one thing tends to happen very quickly. Emotions rise. And when emotions rise, objective thinking often takes a back seat. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer focused on the original issue. Instead of discussing what actually happened, you're discussing what she felt happened, what she fears could happen, or what another situation from months or years ago reminded her of. This is where many men make a critical mistake. They double down on logic. They keep presenting more evidence, more explanations, and more reasons why they're right. But the more they do it, the more frustrated they become because the conversation seems to move further away from a resolution. That's because they're trying to solve an emotional situation with a purely logical approach. The reality is that when someone feels emotionally activated, understanding becomes more important than winning. And the moment a man becomes obsessed with winning the argument, he often walks directly into the next problem, one that damages attraction, respect, and leadership within the relationship itself. Now, even if a man manages to win the argument, there's another question he needs to ask himself. What exactly did he win? Because this is where of men fool themselves. They think getting the last word means victory. They think proving their point means success. They think if she eventually goes quiet, stops responding, or finally admits they were right, they've accomplished something. But in many cases, they've actually lost something far more important. One of the biggest mistakes men make in relationships is sacrificing their frame just to win a disagreement. And once a man loses his frame, everything else starts becoming more difficult. Respect becomes harder to maintain. Communication becomes harder to maintain. Even attraction can begin to suffer. The reason is simple. The moment you find yourself talking over each other, raising your voice just to be heard, repeating yourself 5 different ways, and fighting for control of the conversation, you've already left the position of calm leadership and entered the position of emotional reaction. I learned this lesson the hard way. Like many men, I used to believe that being articulate was enough. If I could explain my position clearly, I thought I could solve almost any disagreement. And to be honest, that works in many areas of life. It works in business. It works in negotiations. It works when you're dealing with people who are willing to listen. But relationships operate differently. If a woman is no longer listening and you're forced to keep pushing your point just to get through to her, the issue is no longer about communication. The issue has become the dynamic itself. Because once a woman stops respecting what you're saying, many men make the mistake of trying harder instead of stepping back. And that's exactly where the cycle starts getting worse. Because the more energy you pour into the argument, the more fuel you're actually giving it. And that brings us to what may be the biggest reason arguing with a woman rarely works the way men think it does. Every time you continue a pointless argument, you're often rewarding the very behavior you're trying to stop. Most men don't see this happening because they're focused on the content of the argument. They're thinking about who's right, who's wrong, what was said, and how to fix the problem. Meanwhile, something else is happening underneath the surface. Attention is being exchanged. Energy is being exchanged. Focus is being exchanged. And whether the interaction is positive or negative, you're still investing your time and emotional energy into it. Think about it for a moment. If a woman is upset, frustrated, emotional, or looking for a reaction, what happens when you immediately jump into a 20-minute, 30-minute, or even 2-hour debate? You're giving the situation your complete attention. You're showing her that all she has to do to pull you into an emotional exchange is start one. This doesn't mean women intentionally create drama for entertainment, but it does mean that human behavior tends to repeat itself when it receives attention and engagement. That's why some men accidentally create a cycle without realizing it. The argument starts. They engage. It gets bigger. They engage even more. The conversation becomes emotionally charged. Then, eventually, things calm down and life returns to normal. But the pattern has already been reinforced. The next disagreement becomes easier to start because both people have practiced the pattern before. What's interesting is that the strongest men don't always break this cycle by winning arguments. They break it by refusing to play the game in the first place. They understand that not every emotional invitation deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every disagreement deserves a debate. And once you understand that, the next question becomes obvious. If arguing is such a bad strategy, what should a man actually do when a woman is trying to pull him into one? That's where most men get it wrong, and where everything begins to change. So, what should a man do instead? Because it's easy to say, don't argue. The real challenge is knowing what to do when you're standing in the middle of a heated situation and a woman is pushing for a reaction. This is where most men fail. They understand that arguing isn't working, but they don't have an alternative strategy, so they keep falling back into the same pattern over and over again. The first thing a man needs to understand is that not responding emotionally does not mean being weak. In fact, it often requires more strength than arguing. Anybody can lose control and start going back and forth. Anybody can react in the heat of the moment. Very few people can remain calm when someone is trying to pull them into an emotional exchange. That's where real discipline begins. For men in long-term relationships, one of the most effective things you can do is create space instead of conflict. If a conversation is becoming unproductive, If voices are rising, and if neither person is listening anymore, continuing the discussion rarely improves the outcome. Sometimes the strongest move is simply to step away and let emotions settle. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, but because productive communication becomes nearly impossible when both people are emotionally charged. What's interesting is what happens when you stop feeding the argument. The emotional momentum begins to slow down. The tension loses energy, and you gain something that most men lose during disagreements: perspective. You're no longer reacting, you're observing. You're no longer trying to win, you're trying to understand what's actually happening. And that period of space often reveals something extremely important. It doesn't just show you how emotionally mature she is. It shows you whether the relationship itself is built on respect or built on constant emotional chaos. And that distinction can tell you more about your future than any argument ever could. One thing I've learned from studying relationships is that space has a way of revealing the truth much faster than arguments ever will. When two people are going back and forth emotionally, neither person is thinking clearly. Both are focused on reacting. Both are focused on defending their position. Both are trying to be heard. But when the noise stops, reality starts showing itself. This is why emotionally disciplined men don't rush to solve every disagreement immediately. They understand that time often answers questions that arguments never can. If a woman genuinely respects you, values the relationship, and wants things to work, giving the situation room to breathe usually helps both people calm down and approach the issue differently. But if every disagreement turns into a crisis, if every boundary becomes a battle, or if every moment of space is treated as an attack, that tells you something important too. A lot of men are so focused on keeping a woman that they never stop to evaluate whether the relationship is actually healthy for them. They're constantly asking, "Well, how do I make this work?" instead of asking, "How should this even be working?" And those are two very different questions. Sometimes the space created after an argument reveals maturity, accountability, and mutual respect. Other times it reveals manipulation, emotional instability, or a constant need for attention and control. The reason this matters is because relationships are not built on chemistry alone. They're built on patterns. Anybody can have a good week. Anybody can have a good month. What matters is the pattern that repeats itself over time. And when you stop arguing long enough to observe those patterns, you begin seeing things that emotions previously hid from you. Because ultimately, the goal isn't to win an argument. The goal is to understand who you're building your future with. And the next lesson may be the most important one of all, because it explains why so many men stay trapped in unhealthy dynamics far longer than they should. One of the biggest reasons men stay stuck in the same arguments for months or even years has nothing to do with love. It has nothing to do with attraction, and it certainly has nothing to do with logic. It comes down to one simple fear: the fear of walking away. Most men know when a situation is becoming unhealthy. They know when they're having the same argument for the 100th time. They know when their boundaries are constantly being ignored. They know when they're exhausted from trying to keep the peace. But instead of addressing the real issue, they stay focused on fixing the latest disagreement. They convince themselves that if they can just explain things differently, communicate better, or be more patient, everything will finally change. But here's the problem. The person who feels they cannot leave automatically loses leverage in the relationship. That's true in business, negotiations, friendships, and dating. The moment someone believes they have no other option, they start tolerating behavior they would never normally accept. They begin sacrificing their standards just to keep the relationship alive. This is why being willing to walk away is so powerful. It doesn't mean you want the relationship to end. It doesn't mean you're looking for an excuse to leave. It means you're not willing to sacrifice your self-respect to keep someone in your life. There's a huge difference. Think about a game of chess. The king is the most important piece on the board. Everything revolves around protecting it. Yet many men spend their entire relationships acting as if the queen is more important than the king. They sacrifice their peace, their purpose, their confidence, and sometimes even their identity just to avoid losing a woman. In the process, they forget that without the king, the game is over. The strongest relationships happen when a man values the relationship, but values himself even more. And once a man understands that, something interesting starts happening. He stops making decisions from fear and starts making them from strength. That's when the entire dynamic begins to change. Once a man reaches that point, the conversation is no longer about arguments, it's about standards. And that's where many relationships either improve dramatically or reveal problems that were there all along. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of men spend years trying to manage a woman's behavior instead of managing their own boundaries. They become experts at calming her down, avoiding certain topics, choosing the right words, and preventing conflict before it starts. In other words, they're constantly adjusting themselves to maintain peace. The problem is that peace built on constant self-sacrifice isn't peace at all. It's simply tension with a different name. This is why boundaries matter so much. Not because they're designed to control another person, but because they're designed to protect your energy. A healthy boundary communicates something very simple. This is what I will accept, and this is what I want. The mistake many men make is believing that boundaries are established through long explanations and endless discussions. In reality, boundaries are established through actions. Think about it. If a man repeatedly says he won't tolerate disrespect, but continues engaging in the same toxic arguments every week, his actions are telling a completely different story. People rarely respect boundaries that aren't enforced. That's true in relationships, friendships, business partnerships, and every other area of life. What's interesting is that when a man consistently refuses to participate in unnecessary drama, one of two things usually happens. Either the relationship begins becoming healthier because both people adapt to a better standard of communication, or the relationship begins falling apart because conflict was the glue holding it together in the first place. And that's an uncomfortable truth many men never consider. Sometimes the argument isn't actually the problem. Sometimes the argument is simply exposing a deeper issue that has been there from the beginning. And once you understand that, you start looking at conflict in a completely different way. By now you might be thinking this is all about relationships. But the deeper lesson has very little to do with women and everything to do with a man's life. Because when you really look at it, arguing is rarely the actual problem. The argument is usually a symptom of something much bigger happening underneath the surface. Think about the amount of time, energy, focus, and emotional bandwidth some men spend fighting the same battles over and over again. The same disagreements, the same misunderstandings, the same frustrations. Weeks turn into months, months turn into years, and before they know it, they're investing more energy into managing relationship drama than they are into improving their own lives. That's a dangerous position for any man to be in. One thing successful men understand is that attention is one of the most valuable resources they possess. Wherever your attention goes, your life tends to follow. If most of your mental energy is being consumed by constant conflict, you're taking that energy away from your goals, your health, your finances, your family, and your purpose. While you're spending hours replaying arguments in your head, someone else is building their future. While you're trying to win another emotional battle, someone else is investing that same energy into becoming stronger. This doesn't mean relationships should never require effort. Every meaningful relation will face challenges, but there is a difference between solving problems and living inside problems. There is a difference between occasional conflict and a relationship that constantly drains your energy. The men who thrive in life eventually realize something powerful. Their greatest asset isn't their ability to argue, it's their ability to focus. And once a man learns to protect his focus, he becomes far less willing to waste it on conversations that lead nowhere. That's when he starts making decisions from a completely different level of confidence and clarity. At the end of the day, the lesson isn't really about winning arguments. It's about protecting your peace, your purpose, and your position as a man. That's why so many men spend years doing the wrong thing. They walk into every disagreement believing the goal is to prove a point. They believe if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, defend themselves strongly enough, or finally get her to admit they're right, everything will get better. But life has a way of teaching a different lesson. The strongest men aren't the men who win the most arguments. They're the men who know which arguments aren't worth having in the first place. They understand that every time they get pulled into unnecessary drama, they pay for it with something valuable. Their energy, their focus, their emotional stability, their time. And unlike money, time is one thing you never get back. Think about the men you admire most. The men who seem calm under pressure. The men who command respect without demanding it. The men who naturally lead in their relationships and in their lives. Most of them aren't spending hours arguing with people. They're focused on building, creating, improving, and moving forward. They understand that actions carry more weight than words ever could. That's exactly why law number 9 from the 48 laws of power remains so powerful. Win through your actions, never through argument. The more you live by that principle, the more your life begins to change. Now, does that mean you'll never have difficult conversations? Of course not. Every relationship requires communication. Every healthy relationship requires honesty, boundaries, and accountability. But there's a difference between communicating your standards and getting trapped in endless emotional battles. One builds respect, the other slowly destroys it. The truth is that a woman who genuinely respects you will pay attention to what you consistently do far more than what you repeatedly say. If you establish boundaries and enforce them calmly, she'll notice. If you value your time and refuse to entertain unnecessary drama, she'll notice. If you're willing to walk away from situations that constantly disrupt your peace, she'll notice that too. Subscribe for more insights on female psychology, relationship psychology, attraction, and modern relationship dynamics. And let me ask you this. What's the biggest lesson you've learned from arguing with a woman? And do you think walking away is more powerful than trying to win the argument? Let me know in the comments below.